Thank you, Mark. You did an admirable job with those names and places. And I'm sure that there are many here that are sitting in the pews that are glad it was not them reading that passage this morning. Anybody here deal with anxiety? I'm feeling anxious this morning. Tomorrow, one of my kids is going off on a trip by themselves. Whew. I don't have control over what happens, where things go, and my mind as a parent just races like, what about this? What about this? Have they thought about that? Is this going to... I can't do anything about it. It's not in my control. There's all kinds of things in our lives. That's just one really tiny example. There's all kinds of things in our lives that raise our anxieties, that make us wonder what's going to happen, that we're struggling with, trying to figure out how will we respond to this. We live in a cultural moment which, though it is like many other moments in our history, for some reason it feels like this moment to us is overwhelming in all kinds of ways. Our political circumstances seem to be really unsettled. The economics of our day-to-day lives just don't work the way that they did even a couple of years ago. There's all sorts of cultural shifts and changes and language that is being asked of us. Things in the common understanding that seem to have just like shifted out from under our feet. When I began pastoring just a couple years ago, I never imagined that I would need to have insight and answers or better questions for some of the topics that come to my desk, to my office, to my conversations day after day. Questions around gender and sexuality. What is marriage? What isn't marriage? How do we deal with the taking of life intentionally as part of a medical system? These things were just not part of the milieu when I went through seminary and my pastoral training, and it seems like those changes have just gone faster and faster and faster. And we find ourselves where we are and we say, how do we respond to this? When we are looking for a way forward, we look to the examples of those who have gone before us. Those that we would hold up as examples of faithfulness in our context as a people of God. We look to people who have lived faithfully and ask of their story, what can we learn about how to be faithful in our story? So for the next few weeks in this summer series, we're going to look at some really familiar stories for many of you from the book of Daniel. I'm going to suggest that you think that you know these stories, but maybe you don't actually know them as well as you think you do. But here in the book of Daniel, we find Daniel and his companions in exile in Babylon, trying to navigate their way towards faithfulness in circumstances that are beyond their control, a place that they actually don't want to be. That's what exile is. Exile is a place that is not home and you can't go back. You can't go back. There's different ways of being in exile. There's the literal exile that Daniel and others have experienced. Those who are displaced persons and refugees here among us, for instance, are living in exile. They can't go home. But there's other kinds of exiles as well. Some of us live in an exile of the heart, where, for instance, maybe your children have taken a path that is not what you wanted for them. They've made decisions, they've gone places, and they are living in a way that you just don't understand. And you don't know what to do about it. And as try as you might, there's no going back. So now, what do? How do I be faithful to what I know about God and being a person of God and loving my child and being present in their world? Some of us live in a physical exile of ourselves, where our bodies have betrayed us. We can't do the things that we love to do anymore. We've had to move out of our home, move into some other kind of facility, and there's people that tell me when to get up and when to go to bed, and take these pills and do this and do that, and I don't have control anymore. I don't want to be here, but I can't go home. As I already mentioned, we also live often in a cultural exile, where we look at the community around us, the conversations, and we say, I don't even speak this language. I don't understand what they're talking about. How am I supposed to engage in this? Never mind, how am I supposed to be faithful in the midst of these things? I've never thought of these questions before. What do I do? And so, let's turn to an example of faith from the people of God to help us consider how might we be faithful in exile, whatever that exile might be in your own experience in life. To begin, I want to give you a brief overview of the book of Daniel to help us understand the context of it and how we are going to be using it in the next few weeks. It's not a long book. It's right about in the middle of your Bible. It's a little book, and in that book, there's 12 chapters. We're going to be looking at the first 6 chapters, but I want to give you a broad overview here. The first chapter is like an intro to the bigger story, okay? And the first chapter is written in the Hebrew language. The next chapters, chapter 2 through chapter 7, are actually not written in Hebrew. They're written in Aramaic. And in there we find a series of 6 stories of these people that have been in exile and also their encounters with the kings and rulers of that place. Now, here's the interesting thing about Aramaic. Aramaic was the English of the ancient world. What I mean by that is that when you wanted to do a business deal or you needed to communicate across cultures, you would use Aramaic. It was the common language that most people understood. So you have the first chapter that's written in Hebrew, but then you have this section that's written in Aramaic. And it's interesting that you find mentioned in the text this idea that this set of stories is for all people in all places. The other thing that defines this middle section of chapter 2 through chapter 7 is that it begins with a dream and it ends with a dream. Chapter 2 has a dream in which Nebuchadnezzar, the king, has a dream of this kingdom and series of kingdoms. And then it ends with this rock that is cut from a mountain, but not by human hands, and that rock smashes into a statue that represents these kingdoms, and the statue crumbles, and the wind blows everything away, and all that's left is this rock that grows into a mountain that fills the whole earth. That's next week. Chapter 7 has a dream that Daniel dreams. Again, a dream about a series of kingdoms. And instead of different metals representing different kingdoms, there's 4 beasts which represent these 4 kingdoms. And at the end of it, I better turn to my notes so I don't miss this here. At the end of those, there we go. At the end of Daniel's dream, it says this: then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. The kingdoms of the world get handed over to the people of the Most High. So you have these 2 dreams of the empires of the world and their ultimate fate. What is the stone that becomes a mountain and fills the earth? What does it mean for all the kingdoms of the earth to be handed over to the people of God? Guess you'll have to find out. You'll have to come back. Use your handy-dandy notebooks that you got last week and take some notes, and then we will learn together. There's a number of themes that come through in this book of Daniel. And for a resource that we're using this Believer's Church commentary on Daniel by Paul Lederach. He identifies 3 main themes that we find here in the purposes of this book. One is a testimony to the sovereignty of God, God's power, God's ability to bring down kingdoms, to raise up kings, to accomplish his purposes in the world. A second theme here is that it is a book that brings courage and hope to people in times of trial and difficulty because they see that God does what he says he will do and that in the end, he will accomplish his purposes. And the third theme here is that this book of Daniel is a witness to the nations about who this God of Israel is. We don't know how widely this book was available or disseminated throughout the ancient world, but it was clearly written as a proclamation, as a story to be read and understood by the nations of who this God of Israel is. As Lederach interacts with the themes in the book of Daniel, he makes a series of observations. He has 12 observations that he says these are things to take note of, and I've distilled it down to 5. Here are 5 things that you want to take away from the book of Daniel. The first is that God is in control of history. God's hand is there in all of it. God does what he's going to do. And there is no king, there's no ruler, there's no kingdom that is more powerful than God. God is in control of history. And that means that God is in control of my story and my life. The second observation is that obedience to God's ways brings life. One of the things that he mentions here is that we often think that if I'm going to do this and I'm going to be faithful, there's going to be some pretty hard things that might happen to me. I might even lose my life. And what he says is that the people of God who resolve to live in obedience to God understand that the times of oppression and hardship in the grand scheme of God's story last only a short time. But what is gained is an eternal kingdom. A third observation here is that evil and injustice are always a problem. It's everywhere, it's always. And that doesn't mean that God comes in and like a superhero and grabs us up and saves us from the troubles of the world we're in. Every single one of us lives in the world that is. There are always injustices. Where there are kings and where there are kingdoms, where there are politicians, where there is power, where there is influence and money, there is always injustice and oppression and evil. If it's not one form, it's another. So the question isn't, how do I get out of this? How do I get away from this? The question is, how do I live in this? A fourth observation is that faithfulness is sustained through prayer. And he says, and we see Daniel as this example of prayer. When times get hard, when things are coming at him, what does he do? He does what he always does. He goes onto his knees before God and says, God, you are God. God, I am yours. God, do your thing. And because of that, he's able to be faithful. It is our habits of faithful worship and prayer and presence of God in our lives that will allow us to face the circumstances we find ourselves in. And finally, his observation is that faithful examples from the scriptures, examples like Daniel and his companions, help us in our own crises. They give us a path forward, a way to consider how we can be faithful to God in our story. So now let's turn to Daniel chapter 1. In Daniel chapter 1, it's this introduction, this overview to what comes next in chapters 2 to 7. And what you find here is that the writer is setting the stage, and he gives us information in chapter 1 that helps explain certain things later on. Things like, okay, how is it that later on in chapter 6, they've got all these items from the temple of God in Jerusalem that they're using in Babylon? It explains that in chapter 1. But if you want more detail about what's going on in this story of Daniel chapter 1, the place to look is 2 Kings chapter 23 and chapter 24. And there you have a much broader explanation of the circumstances and what is happening politically and in the world of the ancient Israelites and the people of Judah. So let me give you just a little breakdown of what's going on. The context for this story. Prior to the events of Daniel 1, the northern kingdom of Israel, the kingdom after Solomon, is divided into two parts. There's the northern kingdom, which is called Israel, and the southern kingdom, which is called Judah. And the northern kingdom almost immediately goes off the rails. And they eventually are taken over by the Assyrians and scattered throughout the ancient world. Judah, though, hangs on for a while longer. But the kings of Judah continually do what is wrong. They do evil in the sight of God. They worship idols, and they do all kinds of other things. And God pronounces judgment on them, and he says, I'm going to end this. This can't go on. But then, there's this boy king. His name is Josiah. He's 8 years old when his father dies. His father was a terrible, terrible king. But when his father dies, this 8-year-old boy comes to the throne, and he begins to learn what it means to rule. And then they find the book of the law. And he reads the book of the law of Moses and realizes what has gone wrong, and they refurbish the temple. They bring back the feasts. They worship God. And it says there was never a king like him before, and there was never another king like him afterwards. He did what was right in the sight of God. And you're thinking for a moment, okay, we're back on track. Things are going to be okay. near the end of his reign, and he reigned for quite a while, but near the end of his reign, Egypt is starting to become more powerful, and they come against the kingdom of Judah to control their territory, and they go out to battle, and Josiah, the king, is killed in the battle. So, what happens? Well, when the king dies, the son becomes the new king. And the new king comes, son number 1 comes, and it says that he does evil in the sight of the Lord, which is interesting because he only reigns for 3 months. 3 months, and he's already just throwing it all away. And after 3 months, it says the Egyptians come in and they take him away, and now Judah serves the kingdom of Egypt. And in the place of son number 1, they put son number 2 as a puppet ruler over this kingdom of Judah. And what do you think this number 2 son does? It says he also does evil, and he does the wrong thing. After a number of years under the rule of Egypt and doing the wrong thing, the Babylonians, who are on the other side of the map, come in and invade the territory. And the Babylonians take away that king, son number 2, and they put his son, so the grandson of Josiah, they put him on the throne. Guess how long he manages to stay on the throne? 3 months. 3 months. And it says he does evil in 3 months. But he's continuing the path that has been there before him. And what happens then is that he gets this idea that somehow they're going to push back on the Babylonians. And the Babylonians say, nope, that's not the way it is. They come in and they take the king, and they take the nobility, and they take stuff from the temple, and they take them all into captivity. It says they take a whole bunch of them into Babylon. That's not the end of the story. When they take the grandson, they put his uncle on the throne. So son number 3, Josiah's 3rd son. And what does that son do? He also does evil. And then he conspires to work with the Egyptians against the Babylonians. And then the Babylonians say, okay, enough of this. And they come in and they basically destroy Jerusalem. They burn the temple, they burn all the palaces, and they take, it says, the rest of the people into captivity. The only ones that are left behind, it says, are the poorest of the poor that can work the land and till the vineyards. What has gone wrong in the span of one generation? In the span of one generation, you've gone from a king that does all the right things. There was never a king like him before or after. Not even David, the great king, gets that kind of kudos in the scripture. Things are so good, and within one generation, it's all gone. All of it. Change happens fast. So, Daniel and his companions are among those that are taken into captivity. We don't know whether it's during that first part, that first captivity, or whether it was that second group. The timing of it is really unclear. But here's what we do know. They are taken to Babylon, and things change. Daniel and his companions are selected to be part of the administration of the Babylonian Empire. This is a common practice where you take the best and the brightest from the people that you've conquered, and then you train them and you get them to serve your kingdom, because when their people need help, if they are much more likely to be happy with a leader that speaks the same language as them or is part of the same culture as them, instead of dealing with a foreigner all of the time. It was a common practice. But in order to do this, what did they do? It says that they're going to be trained. So they are told that they're going to learn a new language and literature. The language and literature of the Babylonians, or the Chaldeans is the other word that is used there. There's a whole new set of cultural stories. There's a whole new set of ways of looking at the world. on their gods and what they think is important and how the world ought to be run and who actually runs and controls the world. And they learn those things. They're given a whole new culture and a set of practices that they must follow. This is a really interesting point that Lederach makes in here. It says they're going to be leaders in this Babylonian administration. How do Babylonian officials make decisions? Well, we know that they use the signs of the stars and that they check the omens of sacrifices, and they do all of this other stuff that is completely outside of what a faithful follower of Yahweh would do. But this is what they must learn and learn how to do if they are going to serve in this way. And it says that they learn this and that they do it. The other thing that happens is that they're given new names. What's the purpose of giving someone a new name in a new culture, in a new place? It's to bring them in, to assimilate them so that they have a new identity. The names that are given, as we read this morning, are Daniel. Daniel means God is my judge. Now this is really, watch what happens here on how they give these guys new names. God is my judge becomes, no, Bel protects his life. Bel is one of the gods of the Babylonians. Hananiah, oh, you see the part that's in brackets? The E-L, El means God, and Ea means like Yahweh. Got it? So that's the connection to the Israelite God. And then you see the change. Hananiah, Yahweh has been gracious. And he's given a new name that says, I'm fearful of God. Mishael says, like, who is what God is? God is awesome. His new name, I'm of little account. Azariah, Yahweh has helped. Abednego, I'm a helper of the Babylonian God. Do you see how these have been flipped? The identity that they had has been completely turned upside down. It said those identities don't matter anymore. They accept their new names. What can they do? These are the names that are given to them. This is the culture that they're in. This is the language and the way of being in the world that they are in. They can't go home. But then it's time to eat. And it says that they're given food and wine from the king's table, and Daniel says, nope, not going to do it. Why now? You learn the language, you're learning the language, you're learning the culture, you're learning the literature, you're learning about magic and astronomy and all these things that are foreign to your way of being in the world, and you've got a new name that's not even connected to the God that you serve, and you're okay with that, but now when it comes to what you're going to eat, you're going to make a point? What's going on? Why say no here when you're moving ahead with all of these other things? Lederach points out that there's two big reasons that we can conclude that may be at the heart of Daniel's decision here not to eat the food and drink the wine. One is because the food that was served at the king's table, more likely than not, was offered to the idols and the false gods. And not only that, often in those cultures, the king themselves was seen as a godlike figure, and things were offered to the king's image. And to participate in that is to participate in the idolatry in which God is not honored. And Daniel says, all of this other stuff I can figure out and I can adapt to, but I will not participate in something that dishonors my God. And the second reason that Lederach points out is that eating food in a shared way in the ancient cultures has a meaning to it. When you seal a deal, you break bread. When you sit down at a table with someone, you have a relationship with them that implies that you will do what is asked of you. To eat the food of the king's table is like saying, I'm all in. My loyalty is yours. I will serve you with everything that I am. and Daniel can't do that. So how did they figure this out? How did Daniel and his companions figure this out and say, how are we going to do this? We'll say yes to these things, but not to this. To be faithful. The central theme of this book is God's sovereign hand at work in the world. You see, in chapter 1, verse 2, it says that God handed over the kingdom to the Babylonians. It says in verse 1 verse 9, that God gave Daniel and his companions favor with the officials when they said, can we eat just vegetables and not this stuff? They could have just said no, but it says God gave them favor. In chapter 1, verse 17, it says, and as a result, God gave them knowledge and understanding. Further beyond that, no, it's not written exactly in this way. It's God gives them positions of responsibility and influence in this government of the Babylonians. Why is that? It's a reminder that God's hand is in all of it. When we find ourselves in places we do not want to be, when we find ourselves confronted with pressures and questions, challenges that push against our very identity, we remember that God has his hand on our lives, that God's hand is at work in all of it, and that our response is to be resolved to look to God and to trust in him. We can see in this story that we can respond to the pressures of living in exile, whether that's the exile of our culture, the exile of our place, the exile of our heart, whatever it is that we are struggling with and carrying and wondering what to do, we turn to the sovereignty of God and say, God can do this. God knows. And I will resolve to obey God and trust in his power to act. God made a way for Daniel, and we'll see that over and over again in the stories that come. Trust in his power. It begins with understanding and remembering our identity before God. You know what's really interesting is that after their 3 years of study in the culture of the Babylonians and with their new names, that it says when they were assessed, it uses their Hebrew names rather than the new names that were given to them. It's like the writer is hinting, but they held on to who they really were, the people of God in a foreign land. If we are to respond to the pressures that we find ourselves in exile, we must accept the present circumstances as they are. How often is it when we're in a place that we don't want to be, when we're confronted with questions that seem too big for us, where we go, I just want to go home. I just want to go home. I just want to go home. As long as we keep trying to go back to the way things were, we cannot actually focus on and pay attention to what's right in front of us. We will not find a way to respond and to act in faith because we keep looking backwards. As a people of God, we're called to look forward, to open our eyes to what is right in front of us and say, what is it that God requires here and now in this place? Jeremiah the prophet tells the people when they're taken into exile, he says, look, don't just sit there and lament that you're no longer in the land of promise. He says, plant fields, do business, settle in. You're going to be here for a while, and where you are to be a blessing in this place as the people of God, because wherever God's people go, they are a blessing when they live in the will of God. We too are invited. No, that's the wrong word. We too are expected to be a blessing to the place we find ourselves, no matter the circumstances. That in our faithfulness and our resolve to live in the ways of God, the people around us, friend or not friend, are blessed because of us. And so, as we respond, we must discern new ways of being faithful. Look, I know what it means to be faithful over here, but when I get put into a new situation in a new way, a new culture, a new place, I actually have to discern. How do we discern? We go to the examples of those who've been faithful before. We go to the scriptures to hear again the words of God. We turn to one another and we say, let us help each other in discerning what we can say yes to and what we absolutely cannot. How are we going to be flexible? How are we going to adapt? And where must we stand? And yes, there'll probably be tension because we won't all see it the same way, but we can do it together. We must find new ways of being faithful in the new contexts we are in. Stop trying to do the same thing the way it was before. It doesn't work in the new place. Let me end with a quote from 1 Peter chapter 3, which recognizes that things don't always turn out the way we want them to. That just because we act faithfully doesn't mean that life's going to get easier and better. 1 Peter chapter 3 says this. Listen closely to these words. Even if you do suffer for doing what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear what they fear. Do not be intimidated, but in your hearts, sanctify Christ as Lord. Always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that you have in you. And do it in gentleness and respect. Maintain a good conscience so that when you are maligned, when, not if, when you are maligned, those who abuse you for your good conduct in Christ may be put to shame. Daniel and his companions were in a new place they didn't want to be in. They couldn't go home. They had to figure out a path forward, but what they knew in their hearts, that is that their God is God. God's hand is in all of it, and if we trust him, he will accomplish his purposes in us and for his testimony as the God who has made this world and rules for eternity. Amen.